You know, every time I get a chance to listen to the Audio-Technica R70x, I really do enjoy this headphone. It has a well-controlled neutral warm tuning, a relaxed treble, and it's all tied all together with a nice open sort of presentation. I think it's a headphone that's been often overlooked, though not without valid reasons. But the focus of today's review is not about the R70x. Instead, I want to talk about two new additions to the Audio-Technica reference lineup. The first is the Audio-Technica R70xa, and the second is the Audio-Technica R50x. Like the original R70x, the R70xa comes in at $350 and can be thought of as a direct successor. Inside the box, you get this headphone right over here, as well as a cloth carrying pouch, which is extremely basic, and a 3-meter cable. This cable has dual 3.5mm entry, and these are lockable, which is nice to see, as well as a 1/4-inch screw-on adapter. In comparison, the Audio-Technica R50x comes in at $200 and has been positioned as a sort of step-down model from the R70x and the R70xa. But what's really interesting about this headphone is the fact that it gives us a bit of a glimpse into Audio-Technica's operations. Because this headphone is designed by Audio-Technica's North American team and made in Taiwan. This is of course in contrast to the R70x and R70xa, which are designed in Japan, made in Japan. And this is not the only one. There's an R30x that's also coming along in a couple of months for $100. And altogether, you kind of get the sense that Audio-Technica is leveraging their global team to really try and capture that entry-level market, which of course is a good thing for us. Now, in terms of accessories, our North American friends were a little more generous to us. They gave us a slightly better fake leather carrying case, as well as 2 included stock cables, one at 1.2 meters and one at 3 meters. You'll notice that these cables are single entry instead, and I actually quite like the single entry design, even though it does mean you do have exposed wires on the headphone. Now let's talk about the build and comfort of these headphones, starting with the R70xa. A lot of you will have already noticed, but R70xa uses a completely redesigned headband with a suspension strap, and that's in comparison to the original R70x with its infamous Audio-Technica wing design system. I personally didn't have an issue with the wing design, but I know a lot of people do, and I do understand the complaints. The redesigned headband here is now adjustable along the sides here, and this suspension strap is what I'd call semi-adjustable. You can remove it from its magnetic clasp and then adjust it along any one of these slots over here. But I find that the adjustments don't really make a lot of sense because you don't have a ton of space to play with. And with the newly redesigned headband, we finally get Y-axis and X-axis rotation of the cups, which I think is mandatory for every headphone. Now, as far as comfort goes, with the newly redesigned headband, you'd think it'd be more comfortable, but unfortunately, it is not. There's more pressure at the top of the cups than there is at the bottom, so I can actually squeeze sort of 2 fingers through the base here, and you can see that there's a bit of a gap. You'll also note that the pads of the R70xa is not any different from the original R70x. So if you had an issue with the base of your ear touching the base of these pads, making it almost like an on-ear headphone, these headphones do not solve that, and you're kind of stuck at square one. Now, to be clear, I don't find these headphones to be uncomfortable. Yes, the pads do touch kind of the bottom of my ears, but it doesn't really bother me, just like it didn't bother me on the original R70x. And while there is a little bit of a gap here, it doesn't really affect me. These headphones are also 200 grams, so they are extremely light, and I've been able to wear them sort of all day while I've been listening to these. I think the best way to describe the feeling of these headphones is that it's just not a very snug fit. Despite having what looks like a fairly aggressive curvature to the headband, the clamp force is surprisingly weak. I do think that with a few simple rubber band mods, we can get it to sort of hug your head a little bit better, but it is unfortunate that even with a newly redesigned headband, it doesn't really improve upon the original R70x for me. Now with the R50x, you can take everything I said about R70xa and just ignore that. This headphone fits almost perfectly for me. You can see there's no more suspension strap, it just uses these simple foam nuggets. The headband, it looks very similar, but there are a few tweaks to it that make it better. For example, it's not quite as aggressive in its curvature, and the clamp force is stronger. So it fits more snug on my head, and I would describe it as almost like the difference between a firm handshake and a weak handshake of the R70xas. You'll see there's no more gap at the base on my ear, which is great. And the other thing I really like is the fact that this headband is a rigid, solid headband, so it's not like the R70x with its wing system where it feels like it can almost sometimes be sliding off your head. Altogether, this comes in at an extra 10 grams compared to the R70xa, which I don't even notice that difference in weight, but in terms of feeling it in my hand, it does feel more substantial. However, I did say almost, and that is because the pad size on these is still the same size as the R70x's. So the base of the pads does touch the bottom of my ear. But once again, that's not really an issue, especially because this hugs my head so much better. The other thing I really appreciate about R50x is that its pads are just nicer. The velour is softer, the memory foam is plusher. And altogether, I think that this headphone is what the R70xa's redesign really should have been. It's like the North American Audio-Technica team really took all the feedback from the R70x and incorporated it into a very well-built headphone, while the Japanese team didn't quite get the same memo. Alright, so that was a lot to talk about just for the build of these headphones, but I think you'll agree with me that was a really important discussion. But now let's get to the real meat and potatoes of this review, the sound quality. The first time I heard the R70xa, I was very impressed. Now, it was at like 1 a.m, so my hearing might not have been the best, but it was good enough that I briefly started contemplating selling my Elex. At first glance, the tuning is light and leans bright. There's bass, but it's sort of the quick punchy type, not really that deep rumbly kind. But the mid-range and treble is where this headphone really grabbed my attention. There's almost a etherealness to the vocals. It's pulled back in the lower mids, so it can be a little bit thin, but it creates this illusion of distance and allows voices to feel like they're almost floating above the rest of the instruments. In that stereotypical Japanese fashion, female vocals do really benefit here, and voices and choruses are highlighted in just a way that I can hear some of those extra little harmonies I don't typically notice in my music. The treble of the R70xa works really, really well for me. Yes, it's on the brighter side, but it has just this right balance of shimmeriness and sparkliness and crispness and brilliance that on the right tracks, the hats and cymbals have just this beautifully delicate touch with how they ring out at the end of the note. And when combined with the mid-range, the upper harmonics of the treble really provide some of the best rendition of pianos and, to a lesser extent, woodwinds and strings. Jazzy tunes, smooth jazz, that sort of thing is a real killer on this headphone. And maybe part of it is the sort of openness that the R70x system provides, but there's a real nice separation here in the mid-range that lets instruments breathe and sort of space themselves out. I'm going to avoid using the words lifelike or natural here, but whatever it is, it's very enjoyable. So those are my first impressions of the R70xa, but how do they hold up against the measurements? Well, let's take a look. Here's the BNK5128 calibrated measurements of the R70xa, and the first thing that really stands out to me is that dip right in the lower mids of about 2 decibels where I say it can be a little bit thin. The other thing that I really notice is that bass hump that it has. It's nice to see headphones really start to have more of that bass hum for these open backs, and it really does help compensate a little bit for that lower mid dip. But like many open back headphones, it does start to roll off in the sub-bass region. The treble is generally above that 10 decibel downward slope, so it's likely to be on the brighter side, but not overly so, as we can see that it's still largely within that gray region. I consider this to be a fairly well-controlled treble response overall with a good treble extension. Finally, let's take a quick look at the channel balance, and unfortunately, it's not great. Where the lower mids dip occurs is shifted between the left and right channels, so clearly we aren't getting some sort of golden sample R70xa here. Personally, I don't really notice it when I'm listening to music, but I'm also not super sensitive to this sort of thing. It's just annoying to know that it exists. Now, anecdotally, I have seen a few other graphs of the R70xa out there that do look quite a bit better than this one, so it's looking like maybe that's, some of the tolerances here aren't too tight. But without a big enough sample size, it's hard to say for sure. Either way, come on Audio-Technica Japan. You can't brag about it being made in Japan and show this. So coming back to my subjective take on it, I was very pleased with this headphones in my first impressions, but how does it hold up after a longer listening period? Well, I'd say that after the honeymoon phase, the R70xa wasn't quite as magical as that very first time. Yes, the vocals and treble are still something special, but it's not quite as special. And it's clear that this headphone is really made for listening to music. In general use, that lower mids dip does become particularly noticeable in dialogue, like in this YouTube video. It can get away with it in music because there are other instruments to fill in that lower mids energy. Now, speaking of which, this is not a lush sounding headphone. With guitars, you hear the strumming of the strings, but none of that really rich acoustic body. And with drums, you hear the initial resonance of the drums where the sticks hit the skin, but not so much the full depth of the drum itself. And like many open back headphones, while the bass does extend into the sub bass, you don't get that deep lingering sort of rumble. But like we saw on the graph, there is a surprising amount of quantity, so there's definitely some punch to the low end that consistently comes through. The mid-range and treble are still the highlights of this headphone. The treble has a measured, delicate sound to it. It's a little on the bright side, but it shimmers with a tasteful amount of brilliance and sparkle. It's lightly crisp and never overly sharp. I oftentimes find that the whole note of the treble is just so nicely rendered from beginning to the end, and it's really what brings the music to life for me. This works wonderfully with the mid-range to accentuate the breathiness of the vocals and give them an overall lift in the music. Similarly, instruments with kind of like a voice to them, such as the pianos, the strings, the woodwinds, they really do benefit from the R70xa style of tuning. As such, even though it's a bit of a running joke for these Japanese headphones, I do find that R70xa does excel in a lot of J-pop, J-rock music, Asian style music. So if that's what you primarily listen to, you're probably going to have a good time. Alright, so I know it's hard to get a sense of things when I'm sort of just rattling off audiophile terms here, so let me give you some comparisons to put more context around the R70xa sound. Here's a rough little chart that shows the differences between the various R70 headphones. The original R70x is warm neutral, and the R70x Refine steps even further down that direction. The R70xa, on the other hand, takes the opposite approach and is firmly within the bright neutral side of things. I'd say the R70xa is different enough, in my opinion, that it's basically a separate headphone from its predecessors. There are some similarities, however, in obviously the great staging presentation, and I'd even say that the R70xa is a little more resolving, particularly in the mid-range and treble, mainly from having just better note definition overall. But what about everybody's favorite headphone, the HD600? And this is where things get a little more interesting when we compare these two headphones side by side. Because despite me talking about how the R70xa can be lean and lack some body, I find that the HD600 isn't actually much better in this regard. Now, I am using the new Sennheiser pads on these, so it's fresh, but the lack of sub bass is even more noticeable on the HD600. So for example, one of my test tracks that I like to use is called Losing It All by Anne Berlin. It's an out rock song that opens up with the drums. There's a couple of hits with the toms and then the kick, and you get a repetition of the passage here. The R70xa does an okay job. The initial hits of the skin are sufficiently boomy, and it's followed up with some depth and resonance in the trailing tones. On the HD600, however, there just isn't enough low-end energy to follow up these notes, so they do end up sounding a little flat in comparison. You see these pretty clearly in the graph here, where the R70xa straight up has more energy in the bass until about 150 Hz, where the lower mids dip starts to begin. This hump is what gives the R70xa a bit more punch in the bass beyond what the HD600 has available to it. Now, as for the treble, contrary to what a lot of people are used to thinking, the HD600 doesn't actually lack for treble, and in some ways it's arguably as bright as the R70xa is when you put fresh pads on it, at least according to the graph. In practice, I will say that the R70xa definitely has more treble brilliance. For me, the HD600's treble isn't quite as well integrated into its sound like the R70xa's is. It's a very mid-range focused headphone, and the treble is almost like an afterthought that's sometimes noticeable, sometimes not. But with the R70xa, the treble is tightly intertwined with its upper mids. It doesn't sound like distinct frequency regions, each kind of doing their own thing, but rather they work together and come off as more even for me. And the easiest way I can put it, and sort of the benchmark for me, is that there's quite a few times where I stop to think about how much I love how the hats and cymbals sound on the R70xa, when that rarely happens for me on the HD600. There's like a sweetness in how it blends the fundamental frequencies in the mid-range of those instruments with the delicateness of the ringing treble. Now, of course, treble is probably the most subjective of all these regions, so take my experience with as many grains of salt as you'd like. Of course, in the mid-range, the HD600 is noticeably smoother compared to the up and down tuning of the R70xa. Yet, I wouldn't call it significantly richer or lusher despite the dip in the R70xa's lower mids or its elevated upper mids. The HD600 is simply just more reserved as a whole. And in general, I do think that the mid-range of the HD600 is preferable. You just can't go wrong with it. But like I mentioned earlier, there is something really unique about the R70xa's mids on the right song. Maybe it's something to do with the openness of its staging, but it really allows instruments to have sort of a separation to them in a way that allows me to isolate the individual melodies that they're contributing to music a little easier. For me, the classic Japanese city pop song Save Me by Miki Matsubara is a great showcase of the R70xa's strengths. From the opening bars, it immediately offers a sweetness to the initial chorus that I don't really get from the HD600. The accompanying hats likewise have a nice shimmer and presence on the R70xa, where it can actually sound a little bit harsh on the attack with the HD600. The drums and bass guitars come next with better definition in the bass lines and greater punchiness in the kick than on the HD600. And despite the R70x being a more forward-sounding headphone, the trumpets and saxophones don't come off as overly brassy for me. All the while, the lead singer sort of floats above the rest of the instruments and it's highlighted with excellent clarity through and through. Ultimately, both these headphones are very enjoyable, but the R70xa I find injects just a little bit more life in this specific song than what I get on the HD600. Yet here's where I would say that if you had to buy one of these headphones blind, I would pick the Sennheiser HD600. It's a safer option because despite some of the areas where the R70xa beats it out, the HD600 ultimately fits better, has a smoother mid-range, which most people will probably find a little more preferable, and you can probably find it for quite a bit cheaper either used or on sale, especially if you went the HD6XX route from Drop. And well, if you plan on sticking in this hobby for a long time, the Sennheiser HD600 isn't going anywhere soon as the reference headphone. But personally, with both of them in front of me, and if I'm just going for music listening, I'm likely to reach for the R70xa nowadays. I admit that there's definitely some recency bias at play here, but this is a headphone that I really want to put every track to my library through it. It brings back kind of that joy of discovery to hear where it shines and maybe where it doesn't do so well sometimes. So here's my very obvious and kind of privileged pro tip. Don't buy blind. Go to your local music store. In Canada, the biggest one we have is Long & McQuaid. I think in the US, it's like Guitar Center or something. And see if they have the Audio Technicas in stock. There might be a good chance that they do because these headphones are part of the R series, which is for their professional use. So it's not like the Focals or Hi-Fi Mans where you have to go to a so-called hi-fi shop to get them. And if you can't find them locally, see if you can get them online from a shop with good return policy. After all, that's kind of like the whole reason headphones.com has their whole 365 days return policy thing, so you don't actually have to commit to a blind buy if there's some sort of deal breaker. That said, I don't think the headphones.com shop is actually going to stock these, so you'll have to find them somewhere else. Now, as for the R70X, the OG, I get a feeling that they're already discontinued or they're probably going to be discontinued soon because I can't find them on the Audio Technica website for sale anymore. I do think they're still a great headphone, and I don't think that the R70xa makes them obsolete given how different they are in their tuning. So if you've already tried the R70X and you love its sound but just held off because you saw the new XA was coming, I'd say go ahead and get yourself the OG. Okay, that was a lot to talk about the R70xa, but that's what happens when you have something truly interesting to discuss. Now what about the R50x? Sound-wise, this headphone is a much more straightforward headphone compared to the R70xa. It's just a lively and energetic headphone that doesn't really do anything too special, but maybe in a good way. It sounds exactly like it graphs, so here it is. You can see that there's a mild V-shaped tuning profile going on here. There's a slight scoop in the mid-range tonality that is noticeable if you are looking for it. The upper mids have a lot of clarity, but it can be a bit too forward and shouty in energetic tracks, and combined with the scoop can make vocals come off as maybe a little bit thin. Impressively though, there is more bass presence than the R70xa. It's a meaningful difference when you're listening to drums where it really adds quite a bit more of that oomph in the low end. Though there is more body now, I would say that the bass quality is still mostly kind of like that light, punchy style. It won't have the depth of like a Focal Hadenis, for example, which has a similar sort of bass hump. If you haven't already noticed, what you should really pay attention to is the treble. It's bright. The R70xa leans bright, the R50x is just straight up bright. I'd say that Audio Technica went a step too far here, and so the treble starts to become strident. Cymbals can become overly splashy, and I find myself sometimes reaching out and turning down the volume knob a little, particularly on poorly recorded rock and metal tracks where the hats and cymbals are thrashing. The upside here, though, is that it's bright because it's a wideband elevation as opposed to being painfully sharp or peaky. In a way, I do think that's preferable because it means that at least there's some sort of relative evenness going on in the region, and surprisingly, I don't get much sibilance at all with this headphone. Now, on a technical level, I don't really hear it as being noticeably worse than R70xa, which makes sense given how they're based on very similar designs. You still get a nice open soundstage and imaging along with good resolution and instrument separation. But I will say that some of the R50x's stridency and forwardness does mask some of my appreciation for those perceived technical strengths. And that's pretty much my comments for this headphone. There isn't really much to say beyond that. For the $200 that the R50x costs, I think it's a pretty reasonable option, especially given that the other two major players are like the HD6XX and the Bio FT1 Pro. So if you aren't treble sensitive or willing to do some EQ to tame it, I could give this a recommendation. There really isn't any other headphone with the openness and bass energy that the R50x offers at this price. You can get used to or fix the tuning easily enough, but it's a lot harder to add those qualities into a headphone. Now, I admit that the treble is potentially a deal breaker, but At the same time, I know tons of people love Hi-Fi Man and Bayer, so if you can handle that, you can probably handle this. And hey, if you're looking for a gaming headphone, I feel like the R50x would make a pretty nice one, especially given how light and comfortable it is. It has that openness to its staging and good imaging, as well as a forward sound that really pulls whatever you're hearing forward to the forefront. In conclusion then, I think Audio-Technica has made two noteworthy headphones. I really liked the R70xa, and while I didn't love the R50x, I do think it's worth a recommendation. While there were a few shortcomings here and there, I think the important part was that I had a good time with these headphones, and I think a lot of people will too. But if this review somehow convinced you to rush out and buy either one of these, I'd say not so fast there. I mentioned that Audio-Technica has the R30x at $100 and it's coming on its way soon. And Sennheiser also just released their new HD 505, which looks pretty good to me. I don't know why, but it seems like companies have woken up and are starting to pay attention to this segment again, which is a good thing for us hobbyists here. So here's your very on-the-nose reminder to subscribe if you want to stay tuned to all the new headphones that are coming and our coverage of it. Otherwise, thanks for watching and have a nice day.